The following days they continued to hear those strange noises on the roof, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. One night as they were about to fall asleep, a loud thud startled them. It sounded as if something heavy had landed on the roof. The husband, feeling uneasy, decided to investigate. He grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made his way outside. As he approached the house, he noticed large, shadowy figures perched on the roof, their eyes glowing eerily in the dark. They looked like oversized birds, but something about them was unsettling. Despite the fear creeping in, he shone the flashlight towards them, and in an instant they scattered, disappearing into the night sky. Convinced they were dealing with something beyond the ordinary, the couple decided to seek help from a local elder known for his knowledge of the supernatural. The elder listened intently to their experiences and warned them that the creatures they encountered were likely witches in disguise. He advised them to take precautions to protect their home and family. He shared rituals and protective charms to ward off any malevolent presence. Determined to safeguard their home, they followed the elder's advice diligently. Over time, the disturbances lessened, and the eerie encounters became a thing of the past. However, the memory of those nights lingered, a constant reminder of the mysterious forces that once haunted their lives. But at dawn they realized that their car had started to malfunction, so they took it to a mechanic. After fixing it, the mechanic asked the husband if he had noticed anything strange in the previous nights. He denied it and said everything was fine except for some turkeys that had been in front of and above their apartment, and he just wanted to know who they belonged to. Upon hearing this, the mechanic turned pale and exclaimed, "You have children, right? Tell me, how old are they?" The husband replied that they had a newborn just 2 days old. Again the mechanic warned him, "Be very careful and don't neglect your child until he eats solid food with salt, because right now he is a trophy for those witches." The husband laughed, as it was clear the mechanic was trying to scare him, so he left. That night, their third in the apartment, they heard the sound of marbles bouncing again around 3 in the morning, and minutes later that foul smell returned. Suddenly they heard the baby begin to cry. They went to check on him and found that the child had what looked like scratches on his face and feet, despite being bundled up. They said the smell wouldn't go away and they had to use air fresheners for that reason. The next morning the husband returned to the mechanic because the car was still malfunctioning. In conversation, the mechanic suggested he might need a weapon to kill those witches, as he was convinced they had returned. He mentioned that whenever new families moved into those houses in San Martin, those cursed birds would descend from the mountain, hungry for fresh blood, fighting among themselves to taste it, and they would only calm down once the babies ate processed foods containing salt, which they despised. The husband, being a military man, said he had his weapon and plenty of experience, but it wasn't necessary to use it as he didn't believe in those village tales, so he left again, laughing at what he heard in that workshop. On the 4th night they heard the marbles bouncing against the walls again, but they also heard various things being dragged across the floor. When this happened, their son would start crying and was always restless, unable to be soothed by anything. This began to worry them, as those sounds and that smell invaded the house every night since they arrived. The next morning she took her baby to visit her mother in the state of Mexico. Her mother remarked that the child looked very thin and had dark circles under his eyes, as it was clear he wasn't sleeping well. And also, there was that foul odor that he mentioned, which felt stronger and more penetrating. Again those turkeys were fighting on the roof, but now in a very fierce manner, as if they were doing it for a reason. They were angry and took huge leaps from house to house. There were about 10 black birds, which suddenly, upon hearing some distant gunshots, got scared and flew away. At dawn, the military man returned for his car, and the mechanic told him, "You won't believe what I saw yesterday. As you can see, I sleep in the workshop, and around 4 in the morning when I stepped outside, I saw those witches celebrating on the rooftops. So I took out my weapon and started shooting at them, but I didn't hit any. They just got scared and jumped from house to house. This worries me. Before there was only one, but now there's a flock. And that's not good news." The military man commented that he was left puzzled, as no one claimed ownership of those turkeys. Curiously, not even the few people around were willing to talk, they just kept things to themselves. Later his wife arrived with the baby. After dinner he told her what the mechanic had said. She just laughed and even scolded him for believing in such village nonsense. They didn't pay much attention to it and watched TV, placing the baby in the bedroom. After that they turned off the lights. A couple of hours later they fell asleep, but suddenly they heard what sounded like a marble, but this time they could hear it bouncing inside the house. Once again that smell grew stronger until the baby started crying. Moments later, it sounded as if something had fallen to the floor. At that moment the child's cries were very loud. They swear that when they turned on the light their child was on the floor. It was impossible for him to have fallen from the crib as he couldn't climb out. She was worried and told her husband, but he scolded her for not securing the crib and not paying attention to the baby. The next day it was noticeable that the baby was becoming increasingly ill, so they took him to the pediatric hospital. When the doctor saw him, he scolded them both for not knowing how to feed him, as the child was entering a stage of acute anemia, and thus decided he should be hospitalized. He stayed for almost a month, but the social worker approached the couple and asked why he had bruises and small scratches. She thought it was due to parental negligence. Days later he was discharged from the hospital, but they had learned that something troubling had happened in that village during the time they were away. That news terrified them, as you can imagine. Both babies were only a few months old, and that very night just before dawn, the sound of marbles bouncing in the baby's room returned. However, this time the baby wasn't crying. Her husband got up without turning on the lights, and upon entering the bedroom he felt something long slithering on the floor, which he accidentally stepped on. He heard a loud scream that made his skin crawl, and when he turned on the light he saw bloodstains on the floor, and the baby was no longer in the crib but on the floor. Instantly they began to hear crying. They turned off the lights, and at that moment they saw something pulling their child by the foot, another by the neck and another by the hands. When the mother shone her phone's light, she was horrified to see that the things pulling him were the long tongues of those witches fighting to suck the baby. She felt a terrible helplessness that prevented her from doing anything until her husband entered with a knife and cut one of the things dragging their child. This thing writhed against the walls, emitting a cry of pain before escaping in the form of a small ball through the hole or crack it had entered through. It was terrifying, as these witches acted unimaginably, dragging the baby in the darkness. She recounts that she doesn't know how she did it, but she threw salt from the kitchen into the darkness, and these things began to burn, filling the house with a foul odor. Finally they let go of the baby, who was injured. They say those tongues recoiled like spirals and that they then heard them writhing on the roof from the burns they received. It was at that moment that the soldier took the opportunity to unload his weapon against those beasts in the form of turkeys. They managed to escape and reportedly headed towards a hill, but it seems he couldn't hit any of them. They immediately helped the baby, who fortunately only had a few bruises. At dawn they fled from that house. The soldier said that despite firing more than 10 shots, the few neighbors they had didn't even peek out the windows. It seemed they knew what they were facing, but they never warned them. Luckily the mechanic had already fixed their car. They asked him why these events happened, and he simply said, "I warned you long before. But because of your disbelief your son was almost killed by those beasts." They didn't ask any more questions and left that cursed town, known by many for its encounters with witches. And that her husband hadn't said anything for fear of being ridiculed. Being in the military, it was difficult for him to admit that witches exist and are not just stories, as he had witnessed this reality. I want to say goodbye by telling you something. Possibly, if someone hears those strange sounds, they can be certain that a witch is nearby, trying to take away an innocent newborn.